Well, can I call you by your first name?
Yes.
That'd be a lot easier than instead of, although where does that name come from? Is it Middlebusher? Where does that name come
Germany.
from? In Germany? It's a German name?
It used to be spelled B-U-S-C-H-E-R. They dropped the C.
It's an interesting name. Well, I think I'll start with you, Eula, okay? How and why did your family come to Southern Oregon?
You mean my grandparents?
Well, whoever came, why did they
it was
come?
my grandparents. My the one that came was my grandfather, Houston, from Missouri. And I don't know why all Missourians came west, but around Jackson County, here in the early days, I think about a third of the people had come from Missouri.
And of course,
it was before the war. A lot of the Southerners came after the war.
in the 18 what? Do you think?
1848, my grandfather came to California, and he was 18, and he came out there, and they didn't come though. My family, they're Scotch. My grandfather was, but they didn't come for gold. That's what so many people came for. He didn't come to California. He came out there because he'd heard it was a good farm country.
And was he married at the time he
No.
came? He met your grandmother here.
He came out on a wagon train that my grandmother's brother was a leader, a wagon train leader, and then she came out about 3 or 4 years later. And I don't know if they were engaged and she came out here or not, but they got married in '53. That was 5 years after he had come out.
Did they stay right in Jacksonville after that?
Oh, no, they came to California, Tulare County, California, and they came to Jackson County in '64.
After they were married.
Yes, they had 3 children. They had 4 children then.
Did your do you remember your grandmother and your grandfather?
Yes.
Do you remember any of the stories they told you about the problems they had traveling, or any of the stories about the early days?
Yes, I remember a lot of stories, but it'd take longer than you have time to.
You go right ahead and launch right into any of those stories. That's what we're interested in. Any of those stories, I've got all the time in the world. It doesn't matter how many times. If you've got the time, we could go on for days.
I just didn't know where to start.
Anywhere. You start anywhere.
Well, my grandfather, when they came out and got married, I have a book. A Bible of my grandfather's tells the date that they were married, and I don't remember the county. Let's see. Anyway, I think it must have been Sacramento. I think Sacramento had been established then. It was '53, and they got married, and they were in Tulare County. And what is that town that's there? That around in Tulare County. Anyway, when they first came there, it was mostly just friends, people who came on the wagon train with them, and they built a fort for the women. And my grandfather and the men would go out. They had fields outside of the fort, and they would go out there and plant crops and everything. And the Indians would tease the women. They were friendly Indians, and but they'd come up there and they'd dance around, Indian war dance around the fort when the men were away. And I had an uncle that was Phillips was his name, or great uncle, and he came back to the fort for something, and he saw these Indians dancing around, and he went in, just took a big old rifle down off of the wall, and he run out there, and the Indians started to run, and he shot at them, and there was a lock of hair fell off of one of the Indians. That's one of the stories they tell.
pretty close shot.
Yeah. And then some other stories. Well, he just told all kinds of hunting stories. They hunted grizzly bear. There was grizzly bear all over California when they came out, and there was a lot of tules on the lakes and things there, and he told a story about a bunch of men went out hunting. I don't know what they were hunting for, some kind of game, and an old grizzly bear they saw him, and he ran into the tules, and some guy that was, well, I believe it was my grandfather. They were there, and they saw the tules begin to wiggle, and they thought surely that he was going to attack them, so they jumped on their horse, and one of the men got his foot caught in something, and he couldn't get on the horse, and he just was hanging there, scared to death, and the bear just come out to the edge of the tules. He could see him wiggling, and then he just turned and went back, sneaking back into the tule. That's the kind of stories they told. None of my relatives had a bad ending to any of these stories.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, but well, I guess maybe they would have been worse if it had been earlier, but I guess the bear and everything were a little bit cautious by this time. And then the reason they came on up to Jackson County is because there was lots of malaria down there around Tulare, in Tulare County. So they decided they'd get to a higher climate, more like the Missouri climate, and they came up to Jackson County, and all of the land around here they could have homesteaded if they'd have wanted to, any place here in the valley, the best land. But they went out in the Beagle area because it was, I guess, because it was like Missouri. It had trees and land, and they wanted to plant
Water.
Good water, and they wanted to plant sorghum. They raised sorghum. He brought a sorghum mill with him from Missouri, or they did, some of them, when they came, and they got out there in the foothills, and they raised lots of hogs. They used hog meat nearly all the time for food, for meat. And after they moved out there, or no, before, when they were here in Jacksonville one year in the winter of '66, and then they stayed there until they came in '64, and my father was born in Jacksonville in '65. He was the last one of their children. And then in '66 they moved out to the Beagle area, and the Beagle post office was run by the man that started it, Beagle. He has descendants in Ashland now. And my grandfather took over the post office and bought his land. And my grandfather took a homestead, but I don't know the deeded land of Beagle. I never been able to find if it was a donation land claim or if it was when he moved there exactly. And then they got the school there at Antioch when my parents were young. Oh, my mother's family came. They came on a wagon train from Missouri, but two families weren't acquainted in Missouri, but they decided to come west, and there was quite a few of them came. There was the two families that I'm related to were the Mansfields and the Rogers, and most of them are living around in that area still. The Rogers and some of the Mansfields are here, came to this valley too, but I don't know them. But my father and mother were both going to school in that Old Antioch School out there. She came in, the Rogers came in 71. She was 1 year old when they came to Willamette Valley. And they came on account of the health too. There was a lot of tuberculosis and different diseases in Willamette Valley caused from the damp climate. So they came down there, and there was only about the 2 families there that had marriageable children, I guess, because there was 3 of the Rogers. There was the oldest Rogers boy, and married my father's oldest sister, and then there were 2 others. My father and mother were 2 of them, and that married. My mother's name was Rogers, and my father was Houston, and they were married in 86. And then they moved up on a little homestead up Long Branch. And I guess, I don't know, people then, they just got married and just settled down any place they could get a foothold, I guess.
Is that old homestead out by Beagle? Is that where you said they moved? Is out by Beagle? Are any of the buildings still about?
The one, my grandfather's building, they were all covered up during when the World War II was going on, and they used it for a rifle range up there. All those buildings are gone.
Gone. Yeah.
And and my father and mother, they built a house there at Shady Cove. It's on Long Branch. It's a stream it's about a mile south of Shady Cove where it runs in the river. And their house burned down about 3 or 4 years ago, but I have a good picture of it. And my father built it all by himself practically. He worked over in the meadows. They had sawmills scattered around in different places, and people could get lumber there. So he worked over there at this mill and took the lumber for pay, and he built a pretty good sized house. I don't know, I know I can get the picture of it, but I gave one picture I had to Shady Cove, the school. They were asking for pictures of homes, and I could get that any time. And then they had, when they'd lived up on a little homestead up Long Branch, and they had 2 children up there, and then they moved down. It's about a mile from the river up west on Long Branch. And then there were 6 more children born. There were 8 of us.
Okay, I think I'll stop you there and pick up Fred, and then you be thinking about some other, if you can think of any stories about when you were small, or your parents or your grandparents, anything that comes to your mind. We'll tuck it in after we get through with a little bit of Fred, but you be thinking. Okay, Fred, what about your parents or grandparents? When did they come here?
Oh, they came in 95 from Kansas and settled in the Table Rock area. And they lived there 2 years and moved to Eagle Point, where I was born. And in 1903, in June, my father was killed when the horses ran away, and the wagon ran over his chest and killed him. Right by where that old mill is now.
In
Eagle Point.
In Eagle Point?
Yeah.
What was he doing that the horses ran away? Was he farming?
Well, he had stopped at Brown's store for groceries. And I believe he had walked out on the tongue to take a line that the horse had flipped over the hame, and he went out there, and the horse had jumped, and he fell off, and the wheels ran over him. That's as near as I can.
How old was he when this happened?
No. He was born in 46, and I was 40 in 1903, so it would be 54, 50, 57 years
So
old.
the children were pretty well grown at the time.
I had a brother 20 years older than I, and there were 11 in my family, but 3 of them I never seen.
How old were you when this happened? When you were
I was 3 years old.
Oh,
Or
3
not,
years old.
not quite 3
So
years
really, your mother was left a widow with some young children.
old. With 8 kids. I was the youngest one. And you want me to tell you the truth?
Hmm.
The oldest one was worthless as far as mother was concerned. He didn't help her. He was a liability. And then I had a couple of sisters and 3 sisters and a brother and 2 brothers. And in fact, there were 8 of us left that I knew.
Why was the oldest brother a liability?
He drank, alcoholic, and gambled. That's why.
Then the rest of the family just pulled together to help support
Yes,
her?
she kept the family together, and we moved to Trail. And I'll have to tell you this true story on the way to Trail. There was, I don't know who drove the wagon that was ahead, but I was with my mother and sister that was 6 years older than I. And she had a load of stuff that she was moving, a little stove and stuff. And every once in a while she'd have to get off and adjust something that was bothering on the load. And we got to Shady Cove, just above Shady Cove, where the road starts around that hillside there. That was a one-way road, and they couldn't pass. So she sent the sister on ahead, and she got around to that little canyon that comes down there, and here came a guy on a horse and a cow. He was driving a cow, and he hollered and told her to get up on the hill because the cow was mean, see? Well, she did. Well, we got about halfway around that to that little gully, and Mother had to stop and adjust this load. And here come that man and the cow. And she had horns, you know, and so he seen us there, and he come riding up as fast as he could and hollered for Mother to get back up in the hack. But Mother didn't do it. She stepped around in front of the horses and got them with a bit, you know, one of them. And the old cow came along, and she ran a horn right up Mother's sleeve and ripped that sleeve out. And Mother, I can remember this. Mother put her hand on the old cow's side and gave her a shove, and it shoved her down over the bank, and she rolled up against the chaparral bush with her feet sticking right in the air, see. Well, a man came riding up, and Mother, of course, thought maybe he couldn't get the cow out, so she wanted to know if she couldn't help him. He said no, he would get her out. And we went on, and that man was my wife's father. And he had a big handlebar mustache. I thought he was the meanest man I ever seen in my life.
Now I've got to show you his picture because
And,
you're going to get a bad impression of him. There's his picture. Now his mustache doesn't stick out nearly that far, does it?
No, good looking
But he
man.
did at that time. And
My, that's a beautiful picture.
I grew up at Trail and went to school at Trail, and what little schooling I've had. And I had a real good life. I tell you, there was lots of fish in the stream, lots of deer, lots of squirrels, quail, native pheasants. There was everything that a boy could want, you know,
Everything.
outside.
What did your mother do? Did she continue
She established
farming?
a little store, and I don't know what she handled, just the basic groceries, you know.
It was in-
She had a homestead.
She rented a place first
in Trail.
in
Yeah.
Trail in 1903, and we lived there 2 years. And then she homesteaded a place that was just, you might say, across the road, and built a kind of a hotel and a store in one end of the building.
Hardware, mercantile type store, probably.
Yeah, just general merchandise, everything, kerosene and candles and beans and flour and all that stuff. And then we had a feed barn too. And she also handled drugs. Now she started over there in 1905, and she handled drugs of all kinds: carbolic acid, laudanum, strychnine for the people that poison coyotes, and all kinds of drugs. And she did a lot of those mixing herself. She'd buy the raw stuff and mix it. And in 1906, Pure Food Law went into effect, and she was notified that she would have to quit that drug. She didn't quit. She kept right on until she was notified, I'm sure, 3 or 4 times that she would have to quit that. But finally, in 1914, a friend of hers just told her she'd absolutely have to quit or be in trouble. So she did. She quit.
But there probably was no one else around that did it, was
No,
there?
no, there wasn't.
I mean, there was quite a, I mean,
And,
they probably came from populated areas, there just wasn't that much population.
Well, when she took over this store, the Mrs. Enlow, she sold drugs too, didn't she?
I don't
before
know
your
for
mother?
sure that she did. I think she probably did. Yeah,
I
she
think
probably
all the
did.
little stores out like that did.
And I grew up in that neighborhood, and there wasn't very many people. It seemed like there were quite a few people that lived way up in the hills around the boat trail, and they were either taking up a timber claim or a homestead or something because they thought the timber was going to be valuable, and which of course did, but it was much too late for most of those homesteaders. They either got discouraged and moved away or something happened, you know.
Why did your parents move here?
Why?
Do you have any idea? It wasn't for health.
Why did anybody come west? They're looking for something better. That was the answer. And he was a Civil War veteran. My mother drew a pension from the Civil War until she died in 1942. And when I was a little kid, she drew $28 a month.
Oh my.
And she increased to $42 a month when she passed away. And of course, my brothers and sisters were all older than me, and they grew up and married mostly local people around, and moved away from the neighborhood and clear out of the picture. And when I grew up and got big enough to look at the girls, so there wasn't very many girls to look at. And some of them were pretty tough lookers, I'll tell you. But I laid eyes on her, and that was it.
That was the last resort.
Well, I'm going to ask you both on this. When I ask one of you, the other one can be thinking, what was your earliest memory when you were born, and what's your earliest memory?
The thing that I can remember, the farthest back, is that what you mean? I can remember, it was before I was 3 years old, that I was sitting in the woodshed at Eagle Point, and my father had a wooden block with drill bits, wooden bits setting in there, you know, bored holes and set them in there. And I was sitting up there on that bench, and I noticed right through those bits came a little snake. And I reached right out toward it, and it bit me on the end of the finger. And I remember there was a boardwalk to the house, and I started crying and run to the house. Mother met me right on that boardwalk with a bottle of turpentine or something. That's the oldest thing I can remember.
How about you, Eula? What's your earliest?
Well, I was about the same age. Well, we built a new house I told you my father worked for. We lived in a little cabin right by the side of it. And I can remember when they were building that house, I had an uncle who was a carpenter. My mother's brother came up there and stayed with us. And we were playing around that building all the time. I know it must have been a big help to him. But anyway, he built two flues in it, and they built a kind of a shelf to set the flue on it. It was at the second story. It was a 2-story house. And we kept asking him why he was putting those there, and he said, "I'm building them to set you kids on, to keep you out of my way." And we believed it, I guess.
Did you stay out of his way a little better?
I imagine we did.
How about your neighborhoods? How about describing some of your neighbors and their names? And if you can remember how they spelled their names, it would help too, because the historians wouldn't know.
Well, my neighbors, well, there was some Dawsons.
That's
That was a real old time.
Spell it for a friend.
Dawson. And Martins, Warners, Hills. A lot more, but I can't.
What was the best part about your neighborhood? What did you do when you were a little kid?
What did I do?
What did you like
I
to do?
cried if I couldn't go fishing every day.
Oh.
And I went fishing when I was real young, which was I wonder I didn't drown, in the river there. And we went swimming, of course, in the creek. Nobody around. We just went swimming. All of us boys did. In the creek every evening when it was summertime. And in the wintertime, I hunted. And you could fish some in the wintertime too, March and April.
What did the neighbors do for excitement? As a neighbor?
Most of them were farmers, and in those days, farming was different than it is now. They could make a living on a very small piece of ground, and they'd have a cow or two for their milk and butter, and raised big gardens, and they'd canned or dried fruit, and of course there was lots of. They could let their hogs run loose, and they would fatten on acorns, and they could kill venison. And before my time, there were a few elk in that area, and then in the summer, lots of them would catch fish and smoke them and salt them down and do some manner to keep them. Yeah, and that's about all they did. There was no such thing, or really is. Of course, when I got a little older, some of the young men in the neighborhood would go out of the area to work in the logging woods. They'd go to Weed, California, or to up to Drain, Oregon, or to Divide, Oregon, and over to Coquille, and they'd work 3 or 4 months and come home in the winter.
Did you? I'm just curious. I don't remember asking this of anybody around here. Did you make ice for the ice house in the winter, in the summertime? Did you do anything like that?
No.
Was anything like that done around this area?
We didn't. Not where we were. We couldn't. No way to make ice.
No way to make ice. Not.
You couldn't
no
even
lakes or
take it off the creek. You know what I mean?
No,
We couldn't store it. There was no way.
So mostly you salted things down.
Had to make can it or salt it or dry it, and lots of people dried the corn, and her folks did. And dried the prunes and dried everything they could.
Apples, I suppose.
Oh gosh, they had apples, and we did too. Bought apples from her folks or her uncles for
Were they neighbors? They must have been.
We
when
lived 5 miles
about
apart.
5 miles apart.
We didn't go to the same school.
Quite a walk when I had to go see her.
Well, I guess. do you remember your mother mixing up any medicines that were emergencies when people would come through and say, "I have to have this right away"?
No, I really don't. Not in an emergency.
She mixed up colic medicine and almost everything, though, I would imagine.
Well, I don't know what she mixed up, but I can remember when I was a little kid that quinine was dirt cheap in those days, and she'd buy the quinine in bulk and the empty capsules, and I'd get to fill the capsules. And it was fun. You just,
How about you, Eula? What was your neighborhood like, and what were the neighbors like around?
Well, our closest neighbor when I started to school was a mile away. We lived on a farm, ranch, and my dad had land in 3 places. He bought some land along the river and planted an orchard in about 1900 or before.
Was it a pear orchard?
He had everything. He planted everything, and where we lived on that homestead, it was light land, but we had all kinds of fruit on it. And on that homestead, there was some land right along the creek where he planted all kinds of garden. We had everything imaginable that you could raise like that.
And your neighbors, what were their names?
Well, our nearest neighbor was a mile on the river down toward Medford, and it was Hannah, J.C., wasn't it, Hannah? And they're an old family here. His wife was the daughter of Dr. Stanley at Gold Hill, and we visited with them a lot, and we heard a lot of talk about the outside world. Really, people lived away from there. And the other side, about a mile toward the river, the other way, we lived about a mile from the river, and you're going this way for the 2 places. There was some people, a man named Marks had a post office there. And what was that post office name?
Leeds.
Leeds. And then we had some neighbors named Lynch that lived about a mile in kind of a different direction. But all our neighbors